Coming up on this episode, the latest on the contract situations of Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody. Plus, have the Warriors found their new backup point guard? No, it's not Brandin Podziemski. Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. Hope you're all having a good start to your week. Not too much in the way of new news or information in regard to the Golden State Warriors. Of course, we are in reasonably the dead part of the off-season here. Hopefully, things will ramp up closer to training camp, which is only a few weeks away now, and then the first preseason game against the LA Clippers on October 5 in Hawaii. But I was listening to the Lowe Post yesterday with Zach Lowe and Bobby Marks. They were going through some of the biggest contract situations in the league and discussed the situations regarding Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody, obviously both extension eligible heading into their fourth year and the final year of their rookie contract. And a couple of tidbits in here that I found interesting and wanted to extrapolate on. So first, Kuminga, of course, is the biggest contract scenario for the Warriors right now after they were able to get a deal done with Steph Curry, that 1 year, $62.6 million extension for the 2026-27 season. So Kuminga obviously going to have a huge role entering his fourth season. I still think he is the big chip from a young talent perspective for the Warriors in terms of someone that they can look to as a potential franchise star of the future, an all-star caliber player, all NBA potentially caliber player as well. I still think, despite everything that we've heard about the various or the respective values of both players this offseason in terms from a trade standpoint, I still think Jonathan Kuminga has a higher upside than Brandin Podziemski. So he's still the guy for me, and therefore it's very, very important that the Warriors and JK can come to some kind of extension agreement, and I'll get more into that. I mean, I've already spoken about it at length, but I'll get into more of that after I talk about the quote from Zach Lowe, who, in terms of optimism around whether a deal can get done, seemed that he was glass half empty, didn't expect the deal to get done. This is what he said. He said, "If I were a betting man, and I am not, I would bet on this going into the offseason, that being next offseason. I don't know that. I don't know. That would just be my bet. If I'm the Warriors, I'm saying, why am I going to pay you close to the max when no one has cap room, and this is what restricted free agency is for?" I get that sentiment. Absolutely get that sentiment. And I've always, for anyone that, listens to this, has listened to this over the offseason, I've repeatedly said on this podcast, the max that I would give JK is certainly not the max, which is 5 years, 224, which is what the likes of Franz Wagner, Scotty Barnes, Evan Mobley, Cade Cunningham have got so far this offseason. The max that I would offer JK at this point is 5 year, 160, or around that $32 million a year mark. I think that is probably the right balance between paying a guy what he's already shown so far, but also paying him based on potential as well, which is clearly what we have to do here when we're talking about young players like JK and Moody, particularly with those two guys having, reasonably limited opportunity in terms of playing time over their first 3 seasons. So I agree with the sentiment that if JK wants a max, I'm just not giving you that at this stage. There's no need for the Warriors to go full bore and give JK the complete max of over $40 million a season, because I just don't think he's shown that at this stage. Now, if I'm him, I also understand why you'd want the max. You look at some of those guys that have already got it and think, yeah, if I get the opportunity that those guys do, then absolutely I can get a 5 year, $224 million extension. So this is why I think Zach Lowe believes, and I'm not sure if he's reporting that as if he's heard anything, but you can understand why there's a belief there that, hey, there's probably not going to be a deal done over the next 6 weeks. Of course, this is you've got up until October 21, which is the day before the start of the regular season, for these rookie extensions to be agreed upon. And again, I'm not sure if he's reporting this or it's just a belief, but you can understand the belief that from both sides' perspective, it would be hard to get a deal done. Now, I also think that in the last 24, 48 hours leading up to that deadline, if the Warriors are willing to offer 5 years, 160, if you're JK, and it's very easy for me to sit here and talk about this as someone who's never going to get close to making this kind of money unless I'm fortunate enough to win the lottery at some point. But I'm not counting on that. It's very easy for me to say, but if I'm JK and there's $160 million on the table and I've got the chance to lock that in, I'm doing it. For what's like, I always think like, and again, it's very easy for me to say as a non-NBA player, as someone who's never going to sniff making this amount of money. But what's the difference between 160 and $225 million? Really, when we're talking about that significant amount of money, what's the difference? And yes, oftentimes from an athlete's standpoint, it's about the look of it, right? The look of, hey, I'm a max player in the NBA and I'm nothing shorter than that. And it's an ego thing. And I think players, I think JK is right to have to that, for that to be an element into this in some degree. But also, again, last 24 hours, $160 million are on the table, and you're going to say to yourself, no, I'm going to risk not coming on as I think that I will in terms of development in my fourth year, risking Steve Kerr pulling some crap and not starting me or limiting my minutes again, which who knows. We all think JK should be starting. We all think he should be playing 30 minutes a game. Does Steve Kerr wholeheartedly believe in that yet? We'll wait and see. It's still a question mark to a degree, particularly in terms of whether he's going to start or not in the whole Warrior frontcourt situation. Am I going to risk potential injury? Like, touch wood. But if he goes down with a serious injury, ACL, Achilles, broken leg, whatever it is, that like the Warriors aren't going to turn around and give him $160 million then or anything close to it. They're not going to give him $100 million probably. And so there are so many instances in NBA history where a player has turned down a certain amount of money, bet on themselves, and it's failed. And they've never been able to recoup that amount of money again. Now, there's the other side of it. There's plenty of times where players have bet on themselves and it's worked out. But I just think in the 24, 48 hours before the deadline, is JK going to turn down the offer that the Warriors provide, so long as the offer is still reasonable? And that's why I think like 150, 160, around $30 million a year, I think that is reasonable, right? Because I think it's enough to suggest that, hey, we are paying you on potential, but it's also not like it's not going crazy. I just think paying him the max at this point would be crazy. And for a team that's just got themselves out of the luxury tax burdens and the tax aprons, first and second tax apron, they're obviously hard capped at the first apron at this point. Do they want to jump straight back into that by giving JK over $40 million? They probably are going to go at least over the first apron next season if you just take into account Kuminga getting $25-30 million a year and just that jump from going from $7-8 million to that. And Moody as well, to that degree as well. So I think there's still a balance to be found, and I've continually said that. And for that reason, I'm optimistic that a deal can still get done. But clearly, Zach Lowe, in this discussion, said that if he was a betting man, he would imagine it going into the next offseason. I just think it's important for the Warriors. I think it's in the Warriors' best interest to get a deal done, because the whole Clay situation last season was frustrating, right? Because yes, you had the whole form issue and him not playing overly well and then him moving back to the bench, which is always going to be a storyline in itself. But the fact that you had the whole contractual situation as part of that was always lurking in the background. And it just had a massive impact on his play last season. I have no doubt about that. He's pushing to be the player that he wants to be, the player that he wants to become. Not become, but re-emerge as from before he was, he had the two major injuries. And there's no doubt in my mind that had a major impact on his form last season. And yes, this is a slightly different situation where for the whole of last season, Clay could have signed an extension for the entirety of last season. Until he left the Warriors, he could have signed an extension. This is going to be different where if JK and or Moses do not sign a deal by October 21, they automatically become restricted free agents. They cannot sign a deal after that point, right? So you don't have it as an ongoing storyline from that perspective, but it still will be a storyline in terms of, okay, how is JK's form correlating to what he could get in the offseason and what the Warriors might have to be willing to pay? And if he comes out and he develops more, has a great season, near all-star caliber player type of season, then it's automatically a max, and everyone's like, cool, yeah, we move on. But if it's not, then this is going to be a real conversation that does go through the season, even despite the fact that he can't technically sign an extension until restricted free agency. And yes, it's a different scenario where restricted free agency does protect the franchise to an extent where the player can't just leave. They've obviously got to go out, sign an offer sheet somewhere else, and then the team has the ability to match. But that's just not a situation you want to get to. You don't want to get a situation where JK pretty much is putting his hand up saying, yeah, I want to go to that team because they're offering me this, and then the Warriors having to make the decision whether or not to match it. You looked at the DeAndre, like I always remember because I was covering the Suns at this point, when DeAndre Ayton got his offer sheet from the Pacers in free agency, which worked out great for the Pacers. But from a Suns perspective, they obviously matched it straight away. There was no issue there. But then you had the issue of Ayton coming back to the Suns, and the relationship between him and Monty Williams, going into training camp and preseason into the regular season was abysmal. And 12 months later, both players are no longer on the team, essentially, after that point. So it's never great. It's never a great situation where, you have to get to restricted free agency. And that's why I think it's in the Warriors' best interest to try and make a deal, which is why I'd be offering something more than reasonable in the way of 160. If you have to go to 170, so be it. But there's a point obviously where you've got to say no. There has to be an end point somewhere. Again, I'm somewhat optimistic, and I just don't want another Clay situation. We even had it the year before where Draymond, right? And the storyline there of, JP and Wiggs getting extensions in that offseason, and Draymond not getting one, and then ultimately he re-signs. But it's a storyline. And the least amount of non-on-court storylines you can have, the better. Because those off-court storylines can leak into the on-court performance. And I just think we saw that with Clay last season. And what's stopping JK from, not getting an extension and then really just almost pushing for it too much during the regular season, like Clay did last season, where it's like JK's so hell-bent on proving himself as this max contract guy that it actually works to his detriment, and more importantly works to the team's detriment, because he's playing, might be unfair to say that, he's playing a selfish style of basketball, but you see that sometimes with guys who are playing for a contract, where they're looking at it from that perspective more so than just the team aspect of, hey, we're trying to make the playoffs or win a championship, whatever situation you may be in. So I just don't want that scenario with the Warriors next season, and that's why it's in the best interest to get a deal done for JK, more so than Moses, because just the importance between the two, respectively. JK, I think, he's the third best player on the team right now. He just is. The NBA 2K ratings would suggest so. He's the third best player on the team. Moses is Moses going to be in the top 7 or 8 in the rotation? I mean, there's genuine question marks over that. So there's less importance on Moses. I still think it's important. I mean, the vibes and the team morale here, I think, are important. And I think that's why some teams not give into, but are more motivated to make a deal, especially with some of these young guys, for the vibes, basically. Like Franz Wagner, I think there's genuine question marks on whether the Magic should have given Franz Wagner 5 years, $224 million. But as a young team, up and coming, had a great year last season, you don't want to put the handbrake on that by getting in too deep into conversations and showcasing that, hey, we don't really see you, we don't really value you as a max contract player. And doing that with Franz Wagner, I think, would have been difficult. Now, I think for the Warriors, they've got a much stronger argument to tell JK and his management, hey, you're not a max player right now. You might be in 12 months, but we're not committing that to you right now. And I think there's more of an argument to be made there than, the Magic with Franz or any of these other extensions. So on the Moody thing, the Bobby Marks and Zach Lowe again kind of reiterated that a deal could get done that's just above the mid-level. So that kind of reflects what ESPN's Kendra Andrews has said previously, where I think she said like $11 to $13 million a season, which I think would be great for the Warriors. Because I still believe in Moses. I think if he does get a big enough role, then that can turn into a really team-friendly deal for the Warriors. And Bobby Marks, I think, said on the podcast, like, when Moses plays more than 15 minutes a game, the Warriors were 28 and 18 last season. And he shoots over 40% from three when he plays more than 15 minutes a game. So the numbers are there to suggest that Moses is really good when he gets the playing time. And the more playing time that he gets, the better he plays, which is understandable. You find a rhythm and all that kind of stuff. And I think $11 to $13 million a season would be a steal. I probably wouldn't do that necessarily if I was Moses. I'd bet on myself. And I think when you're talking about, like, okay, whether or not maybe you get 3-year 40, or maybe you bet on yourself and try and get closer to $20 million a year, and all of a sudden you're getting 3 years 60, 4 years 80, that kind of thing. Well, then we're talking about a bit of a difference, right? A greater contrast between contracts, rather than, I know going from 5-year 160 to 5-year 224 is more money, but 160 is a huge floor, right? Like, that is a huge amount of money as it is, as going from 40 to 60. I think going from 40 to $60 million is actually, tell me if I'm wrong, but I'd say that's almost a bigger jump than 160 to 225, if that makes sense. So even though it's literally not, but, I think you'd know what I'm getting at. So Zach Lowe also said on the podcast that if I were another team, I'd be trying to steal Moses Moody on the cheap. It's interesting to see where, like, Moses' value lies just from an individual perspective, because I think most of these deals that he's always speculated to be in from a Warrior perspective, it's always been about the Warriors getting a veteran piece, right? I don't think the Warriors would have ever thought about giving Moses up for a draft pick, for example. Like, that's what draft pick would he be worth? It's always about, the latest one this offseason. Warriors reportedly offered Moses and all the future draft picks for Lauri Markkanen, right? It's always about upgrading, not, taking a risk by saying, okay, we're going to send Moses out for a draft pick. Maybe if there's no extension before the start of the season, maybe dealing Moses for a draft pick around the deadline, let's say, is more possible, because now we're talking about, okay, if the Warriors say we're going to send out a bloke who we'd probably have to pay $12 to $15 million for moving forward beyond next season, well, then we'd rather give that up and not have to pay that and get in another rookie who is going to be on a 4-year rookie contract making less than $15 million combined over the 4 years. And that's particularly in the days of, nowadays with the tax aprons and stuff like that. That could be a pretty significant way of lowering your payroll by moving on from a guy who's slated to make $12 to $15 million a year, 11 to 13 million, whatever it may be for Moses, and getting another rookie in the door. Maybe that becomes more likely. But for a Warrior team right now who's trying to get back to the playoffs, who wants to be in some kind of contention again, it's not really worth getting rid of anyone for picks, unless it's a end of the roster move, someone who's outside the rotation, and you're doing it for financial reasons more than anything, or maybe it's a deal that's just too good to refuse, where some team comes and gives up a first round pick for Guy Santos. It's obviously not going to happen, but something like that. Outside of that, it doesn't really make much. The Warriors shouldn't be bringing in draft assets unless it's for another deal Like if they got a first round pick, if one team didn't want Moses and the Warriors had a player they were trying to trade for, and that team didn't want Moses, but you could, send Moses elsewhere, get a first round pick in, and send that first round pick to that team that you want to trade the player for. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. But I wouldn't do it. Like, I wouldn't trade Moses for a pick unless that was a scenario where you've got another deal in place where you send that first round pick for a veteran piece. I don't know. The Warriors are just in a situation right now where they're trying to get in the playoffs, trying to be in some kind of contention. And I think Moses can be a valuable rotation piece next season, right? I can see him playing 20, 25 minutes a game, being like, we're talking about him as, is he going to be in the rotation to start next season? And there's a chance he's not. But there's also a chance that he's just flat out better than DeAnthony Melton. He's better than Buddy Hield. And therefore he's, the 6th or 7th man, right? I think there's a genuine possibility that can come to fruition. And I hope it does. Because I think if the Warriors are leaning... I think there's a question going around on social media recently, like, how many points will Buddy Hield average per game next season? And some of the responses were different. But I think that, like, if Buddy Hield is averaging more than he did last season, which is just 12.5 points a game, it's a bit of a concern. I don't want the Warriors to be relying on him that much. Like, I'd prefer Moses go past someone like Buddy Hield in the rotation. If Buddy Hield's averaging 15 points a game, I don't think that's good for the Warriors. I think I'd rather him averaging 10 points a game. As long as it's high efficiency, I think that's better for the Warriors because it proves they're probably not relying on Buddy Hield as much as what we'd otherwise like. So hopefully from that perspective, Moses can get a chunky rotation role where he's playing 20, 25 minutes. We'll wait and see. It's going to be fascinating heading into training camp what happens with the rotation spots and, of course, whether or not he can get a deal or not as a rookie extension. The last thing I wanted to quickly mention here, which is really interesting because last episode I spoke about the training camp contracts and stuff like that. Since then, I think Davis Bertans has headed off to Dubai, or is signing a deal in Dubai, so he won't be a Golden State Warrior. I spoke about the Warriors' inability to bring in a point guard option to either work out for them this offseason or, to sign a deal in training camp and see if they can earn a roster spot. And being extremely concerned with the Warriors' lack of point guard depth beyond Steph and Pods. And a bit perplexed as to why they're not looking at another option. Again, why they haven't brought in anyone to work out at the very least. I think I've worked it out. And I didn't work it out on my own. And I've briefly mentioned this previously. But I was listening to a recent episode of the Hoop Collective, or the latest episode of the Hoop Collective. And the guys on there were talking about the Minnesota Timberwolves and their kind of lack of playmaking to a degree. And Brian Windhorst mentioned how when Mike Conley was banged up a bit in the playoffs and missed a couple of games in the postseason, that Kyle Anderson was basically running point for the Minnesota Timberwolves. And so I did some research on this, going back, looking at a few quotes and stuff like that. I think I've come to the realization that Kyle Anderson might be the Warriors' backup point guard next season. Legitimately. Kyle Anderson, I think, will be the Warriors' backup point guard. And there'll be sprinkles of Pods in there. They'll probably both share the floor together. But I've always just thought that, Pods is replacing Chris Paul. Pods is just going to be the backup point guard. Not only is he going to replace Clay as the starting two guard, but he's going to replace CP3 as well. And I've always wondered, I'm high on Pods, no doubt. His value has kind of soared this offseason. But I've always thought that's just a huge burden to put on this second-year, 21-year-old kid. That's a huge burden to say you're essentially replacing two Hall of Fame players in one here. And so, again, I found that perplexing and just wondered, what's going on here. And now I think I've just come to the realization Kyle Anderson is going to be the backup point guard. And so a couple of quotes here. I think this was in December, after a game where Kyle Anderson had 9 assists, I believe. And he was asked after the game, and he said, I think that's where I'm most comfortable, making decisions, getting guys the ball, getting guys involved. That's just my natural position. So he's saying he's a natural point guard, and that's his natural position. And then Chris Finch, Timberwolves coach, also said, I think after the same game, said, ever since I've seen Kyle Anderson play, I just know he's just really good with the ball in his hands. No matter whether you play him at the 4, the 3, the 1, he has a great understanding of our set plays, kind of when to sprinkle those into. I think he's going to be the backup point guard. I've decided. And so that really interests me, like what kind of combination Steve's going to go with next season if that's the case. So I suppose it's the same kind of lineups, but more so Slow-Mo is going to be the point forward. And he's going to have the ball in his hands. He's going to be bringing the ball up the court plenty. And you know what? The more I think about it, the more I think that may have been a really big selling point for the Warriors to Kyle Anderson in free agency. Now, we've always said, perfect kind of fit for the Warriors in terms of his ability, his versatility, defensively, obviously, and offensively as, this playmaking forward. But I've never until this point thought, he's going to be playing point guard for the Warriors next season. And now, again, I kind of got onto this from what the guys on the Hoop Collective said. I think he's going to be. I think Kyle Anderson is going to be the backup point guard for the Warriors next season. I'm super fascinated to see it. So maybe you might have a bench unit where Pods is still in there a bit. Maybe Kyle Anderson and having D'Anthony Melton on the floor, and Melton can handle the ball a bit. Maybe having those two guys, maybe it's enough. Maybe it is enough. And I'm super fascinated to see. So maybe it's Melton, Moody, Slow-Mo's obviously in there. TJD, I'm a little bit concerned. I think I want TJD playing with Steph a little bit more. And not so much in the second unit. I think he can be more effective in a, I'm not going to say starting role because I just don't think he's going to start, but playing the predominant amount of his minutes with the starters. So maybe Draymond and Slow-Mo can play together a bit. Maybe Draymond's more of it in a second unit. I don't know. Again, I'm just spitballing kind of on the fly here, but I do find it very fascinating that I think Kyle Anderson is going to be playing point guard, and I'm really interested to see it. And I think it might have been a big selling point from the Warriors to say to this guy, well, you think you're a natural point guard? You've never played that position predominantly in the NBA. You've never played that. You started out as a small forward. You've transitioned into a power forward with the kind of the way the league has gone. You've never played point guard you've done in spurts. Again, Mike Conley's injured in the playoffs. You do it a little bit, but you've never predominantly played it. We're giving you that opportunity. We're going to have a roster where it's Steph Curry and it's Brandin Podziemski, who's a combo guard, and it's you, and that's it. We're not even going to look at other options. We're that confident in putting the ball in your hands and you being the backup to Steph. And there's going to be times where you're playing with Steph, plenty of minutes where you're playing with Steph. And again, Slow-Mo's probably going to be the guy bringing the ball up the floor, and Steph's going to be running off screens and stuff like that. And you have Draymond out there as well as another guy who can handle the ball and play make. Super interesting. And maybe it's a way revolutionizing the Warriors a bit. And it's why there's this comparison to Sean Livingston as well. There's been the comparisons between Slow-Mo and Sean Livingston. And again, maybe that's another way or another reason as to why those comparisons have been made, because Slow-Mo is going to be playing point guard. Anyway, interesting. Let me know what you think about that, because I have been big on the Warriors just lacking point guard depth. Well, who knows? Again, I had this conversation on the last episode. What happens when Steph inevitably misses 15, 20 games? Pod's just going to start? Well, he might, but you might also see Kyle Anderson being the point guard for 30 minutes a game. Anyway, let me know what you think. I think it's super interesting, and it's something that I haven't necessarily looked at until literally today when I was listening to that podcast. Anyway, thank you very much to those of you that have got through to this point of the episode. If you're on YouTube and haven't subscribed already, that would be greatly appreciated if you could. You can follow me at POC252. POC252. POK252 on X/Twitter. I'm having a nightmare. It's getting somewhat late in the afternoon here, Australian time. Yeah, that's about it. I'll if there's any Warriors news, big stuff that comes out in the next few days, I'm sure to be across it. You can follow my work on Blue Man Hoop. You get 3 to 4 articles every day. Other than that, guys, I'll see you on the next episode and have a great rest of your week.